What is up, guys? With last Epoch launching into 1.0 today and servers being unplayable at the moment, I figured this was a good time to go over some tips, tricks, little just advice bits for a newer player, and a couple of stat explanations. Just a lot of little information that would be nice for a newer player to know going into the game, along with a few basic strategy advice type things. Just a bunch of little information that I've come across and thought of while playing quite a bit of last Epoch. So let's dive into it. So the first tip I have is going to be one that you have probably heard a million times before, so I'm going to get it out of the way immediately, though with a slight tidbit added onto it, which is to cap your resists. If you come into your character sheet by pressing C, you can see all of your different resistances. As you can see, mine are all buggered. This is the first character I tried to play in the game, and it didn't do great. But anyway, for example, you've got your fire, lightning, cold, which are all considered the elemental resistances. And then you have physical, poison, necrotic, and void. So you have a lot of resistances to try and cap here. One thing that is different, in case you've maybe played a little bit of Path of Exile before, there is not milestones that lower your max resists and make you try to find more resistance to overcome the changes throughout the story mode. It's 75, it stays 75, and other than enemies gaining some passive penetration, there is no change. You hit 75, maybe you get a little bit over it if you can, call it good. But what I want to stress more so is early on in the story mode, just, playing your first character and all that, getting a little bit of resistances can go a long ways. So you really don't need to worry about capping your reses until, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through the story, and then it starts making a bigger difference. But early on, just let's say 20% in all categories, or even just the elementals, because there's a lot of enemies that have those, even smaller amounts will very much increase your tankiness. Because if you think about it, let's say you had 20% in all these and you're playing in the early levels, say 1 to 25, really early on, you're immediately taking away 20% of all damage types right out the gate. That's quite a bit, and enemies haven't had the chance to scale to incredibly high damage yet, so you're getting a lot of damage resistance for fairly little input. And something else I wanted to add on top of trying to get reses early that can make your early game very, very easy is, on top of trying to stack some res as much as you can feasibly do so, get a little bit of life leech, regen, any of the gain health back systems, because the combination of getting some resistances and being able to heal off, whether it's attacking or passive regenning, will make you incredibly tanky early on and make the earlier game experience very, very easy. So I definitely think it is worth doing. The next tip I have for you today is actually just a stat explanation, because I know I am a little bit bad about going in and reading every tooltip, and if you just look at gear and see these stats show up without reading into it, you might have no idea what it is. And even though the in-game explanation is fairly good, I'm going to just give you a simple rundown of it for those of you who'd rather listen to it rather than go in and read tooltips. And that is the endurance, which is a type of damage resistance in last Epoch. So I will simply read it out to you. So endurance reduces the damage dealt to your health below your endurance threshold. For example, if you have 50% endurance, that's this first number, the percentage, and an endurance threshold of 100, all damage dealt to your last 100 health will be reduced by 50%, and it's capped at 60. So again, it's a very good explanation, but essentially, endurance threshold is how much of your health is protected from 0 up until the limit. So right now, I would have 180 endurance threshold. As you can see, I have 900 health, so only 180 of that is protected right now. But when your health is at or below that 180, you take the percentage less damage, kind of like the armor reduction, though this works a little different. But anyway, so right now, while I'm at and below 180 health, I would take 44% reduced damage. Now, it is a very nice set of defenses. I haven't dealt with it heavily yet. My league start or cycle start character is probably going to actually try and run a lot of endurance because I want to see how well it scales up to the other damage resistance types and whatnot. So I'm going to be trying to mess with it some more here now that the game has launched. But let us move on to my next tip, which I might get yelled at a little bit over this one, but at least in my 4 or 5 characters I've now gotten all the way to end game or late game content, I think this has stayed fairly true, which is ignore crit, especially early on. Crit is a very, very good damage dealing stat, but it does take a fair amount of investment before you actually start getting more damage out of it. Just as a simple example, I had a few characters, one specifically being my Forge Guard, who I was trying to run crit on from the very beginning, and that was me putting rings on amulets, just trying to get crit chance and some multiplier wherever I could, and it was doing okay. It was maybe critting 40, possibly 50% of the time, so I stacked a fair amount of crit. Well, I took off the crit and just added some of the, generic increased fire, increased physical, just some of the normal damage dealing stats that you would be taking, and I probably went from like a 5k DPS on my main skill, which was multi-strike, all the way up to, I want to say it was like pushing 9k. It was quite a substantial jump when I just ignored trying to scale crit early and just worried about the basic damage stats, whether that be flat damage or the increased of the different types and whatnot. So I definitely do believe that at least early it makes a lot more sense to just ignore crit, even if you're planning to do a crit character. Scale your basic damages, get most of the way, if not all the way through the main story, and then after that, then start working on trying to build crit back into your build rather than try to start with it, as I think you'll have a much smoother leveling and campaign experience just worrying about raw damage instead of trying to get the big juicy crit numbers, because it's just hard to stack those very well. Because building crit is like a big puzzle, and if you are missing a bunch of the pieces, or if you're just missing the board underneath it, it's not going to do anything and not going to be worth your time. So the next tip I have, which is a fairly common one to be seen through other content creators and all of the talking about the game, though it is very true, which is to buy the Runes of Shattering. As you go through the story mode, you will come across all of these merchants with the little chess piece above their heads, and you will see these guys, Runes of Shattering, 2,000 each. The price does not change, it is always this amount. Now what these do is allow you to destroy an item and creating a random number of affix shards containing, from the item you destroyed. We'll show you an example right here. So what this is for is you would come in here, you would swap to Rune of Shattering, and if I were to shatter, it would destroy this item and randomly pull the affixes, which is prefixes and suffixes, all the stats on the piece of gear. It will randomly destroy the item and give you shards of some of these or all of these affixes. Now, you might look at this and go, well, I pick up a ton of these things throughout the story mode, affixes, suffixes, from shrines, killing enemies, you get a lot of them. Why would I destroy items? There is a very particular reason you would be doing this method over just collecting them throughout the world, and that is that there are rarities, to some extent, of the affixes. So on this fairly poorly made character I had to log into, there's nothing, I'm not seeing anything particularly rare here. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything particularly rare here, but there are, I'll just give an easy example, which is some pieces of gear can roll a +1 to a skill, along with some form of damage boost, like let's say +1 to Warpath, which gives you 1 more point to spend in Warpath, and then it gives you like a generic melee damage boost or something like that. Those kinds of affixes are much more rare than a lot of these like basic damage types, health on kill, things like that, and I can't remember for sure, but even the chance to shred armor might be slightly harder to come by regularly. Don't remember for sure on that one. But regardless, some of those specific stats are much harder to come by randomly, and this allows you to try and specifically pull for one. So let's say this right here was a +1 to Warpath, which I'm using, so that would be a great one. I would then try to shatter it, and boom, pretending this was that stat, I would have gotten it, so now I could say, go put that on a piece of gear I was using because I managed to pull that specific affix off of it. So it's very important to have these so that you can try and chase the specific stats that you want to make sure you have available to put on better gear later on. And being that they are fairly cheap, it cannot hurt to try and collect a lot of them. I did spend my main character, or my first character here, not worrying about buying them too much because, well, I didn't realize the rarity system for affixes, and I didn't bother to try and break down a bunch of gear. And I still managed to end up with, well, 28, which really isn't all that many. But as you can see, you should have a lot more than that and be able to break down gear whenever you find those stats you want. The next little tip I have does also kind of play into the Runes of Shattering, because the reason I did not buy very many of them is early on I went, wow, 2,000 gold, that's a lot, and I'm sometimes finding half-decent gear in the shops. I'm not going to spend my money on those runes. Well, let me tell you, it's worth doing. You're wasting your money if you don't. So the overall tip is, don't worry about gold. You're going to keep gaining and gaining more gold. It's not going to be a particularly hard resource to come by, especially as you approach the later part of the story mode and the actual end game. These little 2,000 pops are going to mean nothing, and early on, sure, you might find a piece of gear that's a little better or something, but it's really not. It's not worth missing out on the Runes of Shattering and the specific stats you need. So I would suggest just pretty much buying these out anytime you find them and not particularly worrying about gold. Obviously, don't not buy something in the shop that's really good for you if you only have enough to get that, but definitely pick these up any chance you get. Alright, one more very important thing, which is probably fairly straightforward, but I definitely think would be worth knowing, is how to see and get the idle slots, which are all of these guys in the right side of your inventory, which all have many different effects that you can work into your build, much like the charms from Diablo 2, but with its own little inventory, which is fantastic. And your passive points. So throughout the story, you can get a total of 15 passive points and 8 idle slots. There is a bunch of different quests that give you them and whatnot, so if you miss a quest, there's a pretty good chance later in the story you'll get another one that will allow you to cap out the passive points and idle slots. And where you can see that is right in here. So if you click on a quest, it'll show you the rewards. So this reward here for this quest is 1 passive and idle inventory expansion. Now I have capped mine, so I don't really get anything for completing this quest, but if I had skipped one early on, I could do this and then get that passive and idle. The other important thing is, where do you see this? You probably saw me running my mouse over it, but at the bottom left of the map, you can see that I have 15 out of 15 passive points and 8 out of 8 idle slots. So I have completed it, and for all intents and purposes, story's done. You can technically start doing endgame content before you have completely finished the story, and I tend to do that because I don't care for playing through story modes repeatedly, but I would definitely at least play the story until you can complete all of these passive and idle slots. I think that's definitely important. You can't get those doing the endgame content. You've got to go through the story to get them, and especially those idle slots are going to be huge, which is going to be moving into our next tip, which is how I use idle slots. So there's a lot of options. There's a lot of different stats on idle slots, from resistances, armor increases, mana efficiencies. Cold taken is physical, so you can swap damage from certain elements to other ones. Chances to slow, I know there's dot damage increases, just raw stats like vitality, damage increases to different types, health regen. There's just a lot of different stats, along with like chances to apply your dot damages. Those can be very important. Anyways, there's a lot of different stats. And how you use your idle slots can definitely make a big difference. So I have thrown a lot of them in. I have used them a couple different ways. I've tried to just boost damage and raw stats with them. I've used them for resists. I've used like all my slots to just try and apply a ridiculous amount of dots at the same time. There's a lot of good things you can do with it, and it is going to be a very flexible area of your gear depending on what kind of stats you get on your main gear. Now this character actually did something, or I should say I, on this character, did something that I look back on and go, what were you doing, dummy? So we'll look back to the resistances, and you see how bad these are. I only have one that is truly capped, and then only 3 that are fairly close to being capped. Most of the others are way too low, and honestly, everything but poison should be capped all of the time. If you have regens, you can probably get away with not having completely capped poison, but you should definitely try to. But anyway, what I was doing here was building a lot of damage. Now, I didn't really need that. Granted, my damage isn't great, this character is just kind of bad. But what I've been doing on my newer characters was using the idle slots to try and fill in specifically the gaps in my resistances. So there are a lot of these, especially the small ones, the 1 slaughters, or I don't think I have one now, but there are some 2 slaughters that will give you a specific element or 3 to all elemental resistances. I really like being able to pick and choose which elements and some of these overalls, and then slotting them all in my idle slots here, just to fill out all of my resistances as closely or overcap them as much as I can. And this does 2 things. It gets your resistances capped, so you tend to fall over less. But more importantly for me, having a lot of resistances come from your idols leaves you a lot of more free space on gear that you don't need to as heavily invest in raw, physical, or, all these other resistances. And since there are overall a lot more damage stats on, like, say, your weapon, even the helmet can have some decent ones, gloves can have good damage stats, your relics, your rings, your amulet, basically almost everything here can roll some kind of damage enhancer or utility enhancer. And if you've got a lot of resistances in your idle slots helping you stay capped or even overcapping, along with maybe something in your passive tree, that leaves you a lot more room on your gear to just worry about damage and not have to stress making sure, oh, well, I need 20 more physical and poison, so I've got to use my whole belt slots to try and cap those resists. This just gives you a lot more room to work with damage stats on your gear. So this is just how I have been doing it on later characters. Obviously, if you roll a really good, let's say, exalted item that has a tier 6 suffix that is like 57 or 60 physical resistance, obviously that would almost cap you alone, so you're not going to need to worry about physical as much, and then you can start dumping some of these idols to try and then get different ones to fill in other slots you need. And if you're staying capped resistances all the time because you got some really, really good pieces of gear, maybe your passive tree has a lot of resistances or something like that, then you'll just have these extra slots that you could then work in some extra damage or dot chance, things like that. So I definitely would recommend using this as a resistance dump area just to make gearing a lot easier. And this has just been some of the little tips and tricks and little advice bits that I have thought of while playing the game. I might do more videos like this where I more finely go into some specific details or tricks that I've been using. I haven't played enough to want to make any grand claims on strategies or anything like that, but I just wanted to get some basic helpful little tidbits out there to try and help newer players or explain some extra things. And if you guys have any real tips or tricks that have really been helping you across your time playing Last Epoch, definitely drop them down in the comments. I'd love to see what other advice is out there, especially from you guys, and whether I can apply that for myself to improve my gameplay, or just having a comment section full of resources to also help newer players. that would be fantastic as well. So let me know what you guys do to have a better time playing down below. And thank you so much for watching and listening to me ramble for way too long about random stats and strategies and whatnot. I hope you enjoyed your stay, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.